The Bible gives you exact coordinates of paradise, 4 rivers with proper names. 2 of them you can find today on any map, the other 2 vanished. And what NASA's satellite images uncovered in the Arabian desert changes the whole story. Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. God writes through Moses one of the strangest geographic clues in all of Scripture. He speaks of the garden where he placed Adam. He speaks of the place where humanity walked with him in the cool of the day. And then, in the middle of a spiritual account, he does something he doesn't do in any other passage of creation. He gives you an address. He gives you names of rivers. He gives you specific regions. He tells you where there was gold. He tells you where there was bdellium. He tells you where the land of Cush lay. And the question that will stay nailed to your mind in the next minutes is this: why would God bother giving you a map if paradise no longer exists? Because most people read Genesis 2 like a fable, a pretty backdrop, a symbolic stage. But the Hebrew text doesn't work that way. The Hebrew text gives you real names, real geography, real trade goods. And the word it uses to describe what happens to that single river flowing out of Eden will surprise you, because it isn't a poetic word. It's a technical word, a word a cartographer would recognize. Before we continue, one quick thing. If you just arrived at the channel, you don't need to subscribe yet. Wait, see if what you hear here brings you something different, something you don't find in other places. If after a few minutes you feel it's worth it, you already know what to do. But if you're part of this family, if you've already watched several videos, I'll ask just one thing of you. Drop your like now. That small gesture tells the algorithm this content has to reach others who are searching for real answers. If you don't want to, no problem, no pressure. But if you do, you help this teaching travel far. Good. Let's go to the text. Genesis 2, verses 10 through 14. I'll read it to you straight, no ornaments. And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became 4 heads. The name of the first is Pishon. That is the one which encompasses the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. And the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one which goes around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. It is the one which goes toward the east of Ashur. The fourth river is the Euphrates. 4 rivers, 4 names, 4 clues. And here is where the problem begins, because 2 of those rivers we know perfectly. The Euphrates today runs through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. Anyone can find it on a map. The Hiddekel, which is actually the river Tigris, we also know. It runs alongside the Euphrates. But the other 2, the Pishon and the Gihon, are a mystery. No one knows with certainty where they are today. Some say they dried up. Others say they changed names. Others say the flood redrew the entire map and wiped them off the planet. But there's something almost no one tells you. Something hidden in a single word of verse 10. A Hebrew word that changes everything. The text says that a river went out of Eden, and from there it parted into 4 heads. The Hebrew word translated as heads is rashim, plural of rosh. And rosh in Hebrew doesn't exactly mean branch. It means head. It means headwater. It means origin. It means the source of a river. And this changes the reading completely. Because if the text says that out of Eden flowed a river that divided into 4 branches outward, then the garden was the starting point, and the 4 rivers ran from there toward the 4 directions. But if the text says that in the garden converged 4 river headwaters, then the place is where those 4 rivers are born. It's a meeting point, not a departure point. And here's where it gets interesting. The German scholar Friedrich Delitzsch, one of the most important Assyriologists of the 19th century, devoted years to studying this passage. His conclusion was that the garden was in Lower Mesopotamia, near where the marshes of southern Iraq are found today. Delitzsch proposed a hypothesis that is still debated, that the name Eden would be connected to the Akkadian term Edinu, meaning plain flatland. Other linguists defend a different Semitic root, Dn, which means delight or luxury. Both theories remain alive in academia. But if Delitzsch was right, then the name of paradise literally describes a plain and lower Mesopotamia. A fertile plain watered by rivers descending from the north matched that description exactly. Other scholars, like Ephraim Speiser, also located it in the Mesopotamian region, but further north, near the headwaters of the rivers in Armenia and eastern Turkey. Speiser argued that if the text speaks of heads or sources of rivers, then the place must be up, not down. It must be where the rivers are born, not where they empty. And others, like Juris Zarins, propose something even more radical. The original paradise would today be submerged beneath the Persian Gulf, in what was once a habitable plain before the last great rise of sea level. 3 theories, 3 regions, 3 different readings of the same text, and none of them were taught to you in church. Imagine for a moment the scene. A man named Moses in the Sinai desert more than 3,000 years ago, writing an account of origins. He isn't inventing, he's transmitting what he received. And still, he pauses at this point. He bothers to give geographic names. He bothers to mention gold, bdellium, and onyx. Why? If it were just a poetic myth, why the cartographic details? Why the commercial precision? A myth doesn't need coordinates. A historical account does, and that is the first clue the text shouts and no one hears. The author of Genesis isn't writing a myth, he's writing geography, he's writing history, he's describing a real place. Think of something more. Imagine the first man, Adam. Don't picture him as a childish caricature with a fig leaf. Picture him as a real being with skin, with lungs, with eyes that saw colors you'll never see the same way. A man who woke up for the first time on a plain, watered by 4 currents of water, who touched the bark of a tree and felt the morning humidity, who heard the sound of water rolling down over the stones, who smelled flowers before language existed to name them. That man lived in a physical place, not in a symbol, in a place with rivers, with minerals, with animals. And the Bible, when it refers to that place, doesn't use vague language. It uses proper names, and the proper names 3,000 years later still resonate. Let's go to the first mysterious river, the Pishon. The text says the Pishon encompasses the whole land of Havilah, where there is good gold, bdellium, and onyx. And where is Havilah? Genesis itself gives you another clue in chapter 25, verse 18, when it describes the territories where the descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, lived. It speaks of Havilah as a region of the south, toward Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. And look what modern archaeologists found. There was, in the remote past, an enormous river that ran through the Arabian Peninsula. Geologists called it the Wadi al-Batin. Today it is a dry channel, a scar in the sand. But NASA's satellite images, published in the 1980s, showed that this river existed. It ran from the mountains of Central Arabia to the Persian Gulf, and it crossed regions where historically gold was extracted. One of those regions is Maht ad-Dahab in Saudi Arabia, known since antiquity as the Cradle of Gold. The researchers James Sauer and Farouk El-Baz, working with those satellite images, published in the journal Biblical Archaeology Review an article where they suggested exactly this, that the Wadi al-Batin could correspond to the biblical Pishon. Sauer was a serious archaeologist, former director of the Semitic Museum of Harvard. He was not a fringe theorist. His article was discussed in academic circles for years. Is the Wadi al-Batin the Pishon? It's a theory, it's not certainty, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. A fossil river that ran through Arabia, crossing gold-bearing regions, connecting with the Persian Gulf, right, where some place the original garden. Each of these elements aligns with what Genesis 2, verses 11 and 12 say. The biblical text fits word by word with a river that geology confirms once existed. And here comes the second river, the Gihon. The text says the Gihon encompasses the whole land of Cush. And here translators ran into trouble, because Cush in Hebrew almost always refers to Ethiopia, south of Egypt, but that Cush is in Africa, not in Mesopotamia. And that seems impossible. How can a river of paradise encompass Ethiopia if the other three are in Asia? Some scholars solved the problem by saying there were two lands called Cush, one in Africa, descended from Ham, and another in Mesopotamia, connected to the Kassites, an ancient people who lived in what is today Iraq. The Hebrew word is the same, but the regions would be different. Others, like Spicer, maintain that the Gihon did flow through the Caucasus, connecting regions of the ancient Assyrian Empire with Ethiopia through hydrological networks that no longer exist. Now then, here's where it gets really intriguing, because some linguists notice that the word Gihon in Hebrew comes from the root gia, which means to gush, to burst forth. It's the same root used to describe springs that are born from the subsoil. And this fits surprisingly well with a geological feature of the Caucasus region and northern Mesopotamia. There are great underground aquifers that fed rivers now disappeared. Pishon means the one that spreads, the one that expands. Gihon means the one that gushes. Two descriptive names, two semantic clues. The author of the text did not choose those names at random, and now come the other two, the ones we do know, but watch out because there's a detail hidden here that is rarely explained. The third river, according to Genesis, is the Hiddekel, and most modern translations identify it with the Tigris. In Akkadian inscriptions it is called Idiglat, in Old Persian, Tigra. The Hebrew word Hiddekel is a phoneme close to Idiglat. And here is the point. If Moses had been inventing a poetic myth, why would he use the real Akkadian name of the river? A myth would have used a symbolic name. A historical text uses the name the people knew. Moses did not invent the name. He received it. He preserved it. He wrote it as it sounded in the mouths of the peoples who lived there. The text adds that the Hiddekel goes toward the east of Ashur. Assyria was the empire that dominated the north of Mesopotamia from almost 4,000 years ago. Its capital, Nineveh, sat on the banks of the Tigris. And east of Ashur is not a vague phrase. It's a precise geographic expression. It means the river passes on the eastern side of the Assyrian territory, exactly what the Tigris does in any map you look at today. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Hebrew name is Perat, which comes from the Akkadian Puratu, another real word, another real river, another river that any modern hydraulic engineer can map from its source in the mountains of Turkey to its mouth in the Persian Gulf, where it joins the Tigris to form the Shatt al-Arab. It's the same river that today waters Baghdad, the same river Saddam Hussein looked out upon from his palaces. The same river the soldiers of Alexander the Great crossed. And before all of them, the river Moses named in Genesis 2. Two of the four rivers are identified without dispute, and both are in Mesopotamia. That already narrows the stage. The garden was not in Africa, it was not in America, it was not on a lost island in the Pacific. It was at some point from which these four rivers sprang, and two of those four rivers still flow today. There is an archaeological discovery that not many connect with this passage, but that changes the conversation. In southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa, there is an archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe. It is one of the most extraordinary discoveries of recent decades. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of megalithic temples, stone pillars up to 6 meters tall, organized in circles, decorated with reliefs of animals. And the date of construction, according to the most conservative dating methods, would be around 11,000 years ago, before agriculture. before the first cities, before everything archaeology thought it knew about the beginnings of civilization. Why does Göbekli Tepe matter in a conversation about the biblical garden? Because of the location. Şanlıurfa is exactly in the region where the Euphrates and the Tigris are born. At the headwaters, at the point Spicer identified as the area of the original garden, and Şanlıurfa in local Muslim traditions is known as the city of the prophets. It is associated by tradition with the patriarch Abraham. It has a cave where, according to tradition, Abraham was born. It has a sacred lake with fish that, according to legend, cannot be fished because they are under divine protection. A coincidence? Perhaps, but the coincidences keep stacking up. The region of the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris, the region where the garden would be, according to Spicer, is exactly the region where the oldest known temples on the planet rise. And it is the region where tradition places one of the most important biblical patriarchs. We are not saying Göbekli Tepe is the garden. Serious archaeology does not affirm that. What we can say, with the data in hand, is that in that region, at that exact point on the map, human beings built the first monumental structures we know of, right where Genesis places the headwaters of two of the four rivers, right where Spicer, Sana, and other scholars had been pointing their finger on their maps for decades. And that, without any need to embellish it, is already enormous, because it means that the region where the Bible places the origin of humanity coincides, data by data, with the region where archaeology places the first steps of civilization. Look at something almost no one connects. If the four rivers were born from the garden and stretched out in four directions, then the place was a central point, a high point, a kind of mountain or plateau from which springs gushed out in every direction. And this, curiously, coincides with the image the rest of the Bible keeps of the original paradise. In Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 13 and 14, there is an extraordinary passage where God speaks of a cherub who was in Eden, the garden of God, and he describes it as a holy mountain. The garden, according to Ezekiel, was not a valley. It was a mountain, a height, and mountains in Mesopotamian geography are the headwaters of the rivers. Imagine this. Imagine an elevated region somewhere between the mountains of Armenia, the southern Caucasus and northern Mesopotamia, a fertile plateau, a point where four great currents of water are born. One runs to the south toward Arabia carrying gold. Another runs to the west toward the Mediterranean or toward Africa. The other two run to the southeast toward the Persian Gulf, crossing what is today Iraq. That image, that geography, fits with several real regions of the ancient world. But there is a problem, and this problem is what breaks almost every theory. The problem is called the flood. Genesis chapters 6 through 9 describe a global inundation, an inundation that, according to the text, covered the highest mountains. And if the flood was as massive as Genesis describes, then the geography of the world before the flood was radically different from the geography of the world after the flood. The rivers would change. The mountains would shift through seismic activity. The coastlines would be redrawn. The ancient channels would be erased under layers of sediment. And this leaves a disconcerting detail. If the flood remade the map, why does Moses, writing after the flood, still use the ancient names? Why do the Euphrates and the Tigris keep their names? Why does he speak of the Pishon and the Gihon as if they still existed? There are three possible answers, and none of them is definitive. The first answer is that Moses is describing the pre-Diluvian world. He is remembering a geography that no longer exists. He is giving you a map of a lost world, like someone describing a city buried beneath the sea. The names are still there because they are the names passed from generation to generation, even if the places can no longer be found. The second answer is that after the flood, the survivors, the sons of Noah, renamed the rivers of the New World with the names of the rivers of the Lost World. Just as the European settlers called a city in America New York, the descendants of Noah would have called rivers new to them Euphrates and Tigris. In that case, the Euphrates and the Tigris you see on the map today would not be the originals. They would be their namesakes, their copies baptized with the same name. And the third answer, the most radical, is that the flood didn't remake all the geography, but partially modified it. And the four rivers are still there, but two of them, the Pishon and the Gihon, lost flow over time and stopped running, remaining only as dry channels visible from space, like the Wadi al-Batin. Each of those answers opens a different universe, and none of them is explained on Sunday morning. Before we go to the strongest stretch, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it in the comments. Of the three theories you heard, which one seems most likely? The one from Delitzsch in southern Mesopotamia, beside the marshes of Iraq? The one from Speiser at the Armenian headwaters of the Euphrates? Or the one from Zarins, submerged beneath the Persian Gulf? Write it below. I'm interested in reading what each one thinks. And if you haven't yet dropped your like on the video, do it now, because what's coming in the next minutes is the part that connects this passage with everything the Bible says afterwards. Without that bridge, Eden remains a curiosity. With that bridge, it becomes the key to everything. Before continuing to dig deeper, think about what you're listening to. A text written more than 3,000 years ago gives you 4 geographic names. 2 we know today. The other 2 are in serious academic discussion among Assyriologists, archaeologists, and geologists. Scholars like Delitzsch, Speiser, Sarna, Walton, Wenham, and Kitchen have dedicated entire portions of their careers to this passage. And the consensus conclusion that most reach is that the text is not mythical. The text is describing a real region of the ancient world, even if we cannot identify it with absolute certainty. And that is already an enormous statement, because it means that the Bible, on its first pages, is not telling you a symbolic tale. It's telling you of a place. And if the garden was a real place, then Adam was a real man, and the fall was a real event. And the promise of redemption that crosses all of Scripture has a geographic point of origin. It doesn't float in the air. It has roots in the earth. Now comes the most surprising part of the passage, and the part almost never preached. Verse 12 says that in Havilah, the land surrounding the Pishon, there are 3 products: gold, bdellium, and onyx. Why does Moses bother giving you a list of commercial products? What does gold have to do with paradise? Here enters a detail that changes the whole reading of the book. Those 3 products, gold, bdellium, and onyx, reappear much later in the Bible. They reappear in Exodus, in the description of the tabernacle, in the garments of the high priest. Gold overlaid the furniture of the holy place and the Ark of the Covenant. Onyx was set in the ephod of the high priest, with the names of the 12 tribes engraved on it. And bdellium appears in Numbers chapter 11, verse 7, compared to the appearance of the manna, the bread that fell from heaven. A coincidence? Hardly. What Moses is doing, subtly, is connecting the original garden to the tabernacle. The products of paradise are used to build the sanctuary where God dwells with his people. It's as if Moses said to you, "Look, this sanctuary we are building in the desert is a functional replica of that garden that was lost. Here we are once again in the presence of God. Here there is gold, there is bdellium, there is onyx. Here, in miniature, the first dwelling returns." And this pattern extends. Much later in the last book of the Bible, in Revelation chapter 22, John describes the New Jerusalem. And in the middle of the city, a river descends, a single river. And on both sides of the river stands the tree of life, just like in Genesis. The Bible opens with a garden, a river, and a tree, and closes with a city, a river, and a tree. As if all of Scripture were a circle, as if God were rebuilding step by step what was lost in Genesis 3, and this explains to you why the garden matters. It isn't only geography, it's theology. It's the first image of what God wants for you. It's the model, it's the blueprint. And the loss of paradise is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the search. But let's return to the map. There is one more theory, perhaps the most fascinating of all, proposed by the Assyriologist Juris Zarins in the 1980s. Zarins studied the satellite images of the Persian Gulf and noticed something extraordinary. At the end of the last ice age, about 10 or 12,000 years ago, sea level was much lower. The Persian Gulf, as we know it today, did not exist. It was a fertile plain, a vast habitable region with rivers crossing and watering it. And when the ice melted, that plain flooded, it went underwater. Zarins proposed that the biblical garden would be right there, beneath the Persian Gulf, in a region submerged by the rise of sea level. And the four rivers of Genesis would be the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Karun, a river that today empties in Iran, and the Wadi al-Batin. For Zarins, the picture is sharp. Four currents converging on a habitable plain. A plain that for millennia was dry, fertile, full of vegetation, and then, in a matter of centuries or perhaps decades, submerged. The inhabitants who lived there would have had to retreat toward the higher lands, toward the north, toward the mountains, toward where today the first documented civilizations stand, toward Sumer, and that fits with something. The first Sumerian cities appear right on the northern border of the Persian Gulf, as if they had been founded by refugees of a more ancient world, lost under the water. Eridu, one of the oldest known cities, is precisely at that edge. And the Sumerian texts remember an earlier time, a time when men lived close to the water in the south, a time that for them was already legend. That theory has a problem. It doesn't sit well with the traditional biblical chronology, which places creation much closer in time. But it has an enormous virtue. It explains why two of the four rivers are no longer seen. They would lie buried beneath the water of the Gulf. And it explains why the text of Genesis, written much later, preserves the memory of a landscape no one could see with their own eyes. Imagine the scene, a fertile region near a mouth of rivers, a plain with trees, springs, and animals, and at some point in the remote past, the sea advancing slowly, year after year, kilometer after kilometer, until it covered everything. A kind of submerged paradise, a place no one can return to physically because it lies under 50 or 60 meters of salt water. Is that the right answer? We don't know. But it is one of the most serious theories that exist, and it appears in academic archaeology journals, not in books of pseudo-history. Zarins published his proposal in indexed journals. He discussed it at conferences. Other archaeologists responded, criticized, adjusted. It is real science, done with real data. And notice what these three theories share. Each one is born from taking the text seriously. Each one is born from reading Genesis 2, not as legend, but as geographic description. And that is what distinguishes the biblical text from the parallel myths of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian and Babylonian myths about origins are floating without precise geography. They speak of symbolic gardens in symbolic places, but Genesis anchors itself. It gives you names, it gives you directions, it gives you products, it tells you where there is gold. The text invites you to search. It doesn't tell you forget it, it was mythical. It tells you go, look, it was there. And that invitation is what has kept the search alive for centuries. Now, before closing, there's a question you have to ask yourself. And it's the most uncomfortable question of all. If the garden existed, why did God allow it to be lost? Genesis 3 answers that question with a single word: sin. Adam and Eve were expelled, not because of an administrative error, not because of bad luck, because of a conscious decision that broke something that could no longer be repaired in the same way. And in verse 24 of that chapter, something happens that almost no one comments on. God places cherubim at the entrance of the garden, and a flaming sword turning every way, to guard the way to the tree of life. Notice that. God did not destroy the garden. He closed it. He sealed it. He placed it under angelic guard, which means that, for a time, that site went on existing somewhere on the planet, inaccessible, guarded, perhaps until the flood, perhaps beyond, but the text leaves open the possibility that that place, at some point, was still there, geographically. And that gives enormous weight to the four rivers, because Moses, writing centuries later, may be describing not only the original paradise, but the place where paradise was sealed. A specific region, a concrete coordinate, with angelic guardians placed by God himself. Is that region still guarded today, or did the cherubim withdraw at some point after the flood, when the landscape changed so much that there was no longer anything physical to guard? The text does not answer, but the image is powerful, and the image has consequences. Because if the cherubim guarded the way to the tree of life, then the tree of life was the principal object. Not the garden itself, the tree. And the tree reappears, as you already saw in Revelation 22. The tree was not lost. It was relocated. It was lifted up. It was placed in the new creation, waiting. And here the circle closes. The four rivers give you a map of a lost place, but they also give you symbolically a map of something to come. The New Jerusalem will not have four rivers. It will have one, but that single river, beside the tree of life, will do what the four rivers of the original paradise could not sustain: an eternal presence with God. No expulsion, no cherubim guarding the entrance, no flaming sword. And that is why the passage of Genesis 2 is not a geographic curiosity. It is a promise. It is the first promise of the Bible. The promise that the garden was not a whim of God. It was a blueprint, and the blueprint will be fulfilled. Look at what you now have before you. An ancient text written more than 3,000 years ago that dares to give you coordinates. A text that has resisted centuries of criticism and still produces serious archaeological theories. A text that connects the products of paradise with the tabernacle and the tree of the original garden with the tree of the New Jerusalem. A text that doesn't float in the air, but anchors itself in rivers with proper names. Do we know exactly where that place was? No, there are three serious theories, and none has won a definitive consensus. But most scholars concentrate the search on the region that runs from eastern Armenia to the Persian Gulf, crossing what is today Iraq, southeastern Turkey, and northern Arabia. That region, not by chance, is the cradle of the oldest known civilizations: Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon, the first cities in the world, the first writing, the first legal codes, and all of that right where Genesis tells you the garden once stood. If it were coincidence, it would be one of the most extraordinary coincidences in history. But the Bible does not seem to treat it as coincidence. It seems to treat it as data, as footprint, as trace. And the trace is still there. In the maps, in the names of the rivers, in the underground aquifers, in the satellite images that show dry channels crossing Arabia, in the marshes of southern Iraq, in the gold of Ma'd ad-Dahab, in the Mesopotamian onyx. Four rivers, four clues, and a text that refuses to be read as myth. Perhaps we will never find the garden. Perhaps it lies under water or under desert, or sealed in a way archaeology cannot reach. But the lesson is not geographic. The lesson is theological. God left clues, God left traces, God left a map. And that map does not end in the desert of Arabia nor in the marshes of Iraq. That map ends in a person. It ends in the one who said, "I am the way and the truth and the life." It ends in the one who offers, not a return to the lost paradise, but an entry into the New Jerusalem. The tree of life that stood guarded by cherubim in Genesis 3 is open, free, accessible to all who believe. In Revelation 22, that is what the coordinates hidden in Genesis 2 are telling you, not only where it was, but where we are going. Read the text again with those eyes, Genesis 2 verses 10 through 14, and ask yourself why a writer of Sinai more than 3,000 years ago would bother giving you names of rivers, regions, and commercial products if it weren't because he wanted to leave you a map. The map is still there, and you already know where it points.